Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. This is such a unique conference and there are so many wonderfully interesting people here. And I can't see my notes. Hi, can I have some notes? Thanks. So I should introduce myself. I originally trained as a psychologist, and in the final year, my honours year in the psychology program. Oh, yeah, okay, that would help. Sorry, my fault. By the final year of my psychology program, I was had already begun p-hacking. I was very young. I didn't know what it was called, and I didn't make it up. Of course, you need a coach for this kind of thing. And so what I was coached in was bringing 20 participants into the lab and running the experiment and analysing the data, having a look at the p-value, bringing in another 10 subjects, analysing the data again, and so on. And it turns out I had quite a talent for it because what happened at the end of that project was that instead of being like kicked out of the program or something, I won a prize for the best project in my year. And I didn't know what QRPs were. This was just like the mid-90s. But I did know that what was going on was a bit weird. Right? So I'd had quite good, surprisingly good statistical training for the time and the place that I was in. And I knew that the research process that I had just been through didn't match with that formal training in statistical power and effect sizes. So what I did after that was I left psychology and defected into a history and philosophy of science department where I met Neil Thomason, who was teaching a course on the philosophy of statistics. And it was there that I learned for the very first time that all of these criticisms of p-values were in fact well established and well known and had been around for decades. So the whole 4 years in the psych program, not a word was spoken about this, which I also then thought was quite strange. So I embarked on a PhD to kind of investigate why that was the case. So I ended up writing my PhD dissertation about how these criticisms, literally thousands of criticisms of null hypothesis testing by that time had played out in different disciplines, in medicine, in psychology, and in ecology. And when I finished that in 2005, I thought, this is going nowhere. I've just documented exactly 5-6 decades of this going exactly and precisely nowhere. There's nothing left for me here. It turns out I was wrong about that. It was going somewhere, and now we're all here in the middle of some kind of revolution. So that's nice. But unfortunately, what has happened, you see, is that over the last 2 days with all of these wonderfully interesting talks, I feel like everything there is to say about this has already been said. Stephen Goodman's talk yesterday, for example. So I stayed up very late last night desperately trying to create some new material to fill in our time together here this morning. But honestly, we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here. So as you've heard, the theme is how scientists interpret and treat evidence. And I thought what might be relevant to that is to talk about how scientists think about concepts. So this is a very low-tech talk today. I'm going to talk about a couple of survey and interview studies. Some are old, some are new. Pretty much everything I say is only descriptive. You may be relieved to hear that I will not be making any claims, and I definitely won't be making any decisions based on inferential statistics from these small preliminary studies. So first I'll talk about replicability as a concept, just very quickly, and then I'll talk about statistics. Misconceptions about statistics, particularly misconceptions about p-values and confidence intervals. And what I want to say really about that is that all statistics have misconceptions associated with them. Statistics are hard. But I want to just kind of plant the seed of a question about whether all of these misconceptions are equally bad or equally severe? Do they really have the same consequences, some worse than others? And what does worse mean? And then finally, I want to talk about statistics as rhetoric. We'll get to that. Okay, so now I'm going to take you back in time to the mid-1980s, a sociological pilgrimage. So in this book, there's a chapter called Replication and Mere Replication. And as we all know, replication is the cornerstone of the scientific method, but back in the 80s, there was this rumour flying around in some sociology departments that this might not be quite true, that perhaps scientists weren't technically engaging in actual replication studies, that perhaps replication was less of a cornerstone and more of a rhetorical strategy that scientists were using in the social negotiation of knowledge claims. Mulcahy and Gilbert here decided that they would actually interview some scientists about this, which was sort of groundbreaking for the time. And they happened upon a group of biochemists all working in the same area. And they did this really fascinating series of interviews with them. So, surprise, they weren't doing any replication studies. But it's actually a whole lot more interesting than that. So the interview transcripts look like this. The interviewer, having discovered that they're not doing any replication studies, says, just to clarify, does that imply that you don't repeat other people's experiments? And the biochemist says, yeah, never. And then the interviewer asks, does anyone repeat your experiments? Oh. Does anyone repeat my experiments? Yes. Yes, they do. And this happens over and over again in all the interviews. No one's repeating anyone else's, but everyone's own work is being repeated. And they explain what they mean by their work being repeated. So what Mulcahy and Gilbert could have taken away from this was just this was just straightforward evidence that this dominant view in sociology was right. The replication is just a rhetorical strategy. But that's in fact not the interpretation that they made. Instead, they identified this as an instance of conceptual slippage. So replication is a pretty broad concept, and in these interviews, in most of these conversations, what this concept means is it was underspecified. So when the interviewer asked the first question here about repeating other people's experiments, that called to mind for the scientists a very narrow definition of replication, maybe something like, what's talked about as direct or exact replication. But later, when they were asking about the scientists' own work, and what made them have faith or trust that that work was repeatable, suddenly that concept expanded. They had a much broader definition now of what replication means, maybe something more like, how we would talk about conceptual replication. Now, I'm not using this example to try and create or reinforce this typology of direct and conceptual replication. I'm not sure I believe in that distinction at all, really, but rather to say that this explanation of conceptual slippage here, I think, is really interesting. It means that it leaves these scientists as not being dishonest and not even kind of trickily engaged in some kind of political strategy or rhetorical strategy. It's just they're just kind of rolling around in a messy concept that is shrinking and expanding depending on the concept. So I think that's a nice sort of and generous explanation. So more recently we decided to kind of get involved in a bit of this sort of stuff ourselves, and this is a survey of 400 ecologists, some from a conference in America, some from a conference in Australia. We asked them a whole lot of questions. I'm not going to go through all of the questions here. And we also gave them lots of space to just give us open-ended comments. And then we also gave them the opportunity to do an interview with us, and it turns out these people have a lot to say. We've got a lot of qualitative data here, more than we've been able to process. So we asked them things like, do you think replication studies are important? And they said yes. Do you think there should be more? Yes. Should they be published? And they said yes. I mean, there was a bit of, should they be published everywhere or should they only be published in special editions? But overall, yes. And then we asked them this question that we thought would really sort of weed out any negative use. Do you think they're a good use of resources, or should we only focus on new novel stuff? And that did sort of temper their response a little bit. But overwhelmingly, these people really like replication. So that's great that they like it. They want to spend money on it, publish it. And then we thought, well, we'd ask them, what's it for? What do you do with it? What epistemic value does it have? In fact, we asked them this: does an effect or a phenomenon need to be successfully replicated before you believe or trust it? And they said, maybe. So we decided to repeat the survey with some psychologists. And we had a sample of 450 psychologists, some in Italy, collected by Franco Agnoli, and about half in Australia. We asked them the same questions, and we got pretty much the same answers. They think it's important, they think there should be more, they think it should be published, and, they think it's an okay, at least, use of resources. So then we asked them again, what's it for? do you need it to believe stuff? And maybe some of them think maybe you do. But it's not an overwhelming, it's very much a maybe kind of response here. So what I think is going on in our results is the same kind of conceptual slippage that Marquet and Gilbert saw in the 80s. The other question that I haven't showed you here was we asked these scientists to estimate what they thought the replication rate in their not the replication rate, that's confusing. We asked them to estimate how many studies in the published literature were replication studies, so how much replication that was going on in their discipline. And they did, on average, overestimate this. So in the ecology sample, I think the median response was something like about 10%. And in fact, in ecology, the number of replication studies is like a very small fraction of 1%. So they overestimated it, but they still knew it was low. So they knew it was important, that they wanted more of it, that it should be published, that it was already low, but they didn't think they necessarily needed it to increase their belief in an effect being real. And I think the reason why I think this is conceptual slippage is that it's hard to imagine how else you could believe all of those things at the same time. Okay, so now I want to talk about misconceptions of statistical evidence. And, there are lots of them. These have all been very well documented, I think, starting with Michael Oakes in the 1980s and Haller and Krauss, and I've done surveys on this, and so probably a dozen of you. There's lots of them. There are also lots of well-documented misconceptions about confidence intervals. Some are definitional, so people get the kind of definition of the confidence interval wrong. They think it's like a descriptive statistic that's telling them, estimating their sample mean, which is really weird, or they think it's like a range or a truncated range. And then there are relational misconceptions where they don't know how the bits fit together, like how changing the confidence level is going to influence the width. So some of these misconceptions over here match ones over here. So you can have the inverse probability fallacy, for example, in both cases. And then some of them are different. And we could keep adding, we could add columns to this for any kind of statistics. I didn't fill it in, but you could fill it in, right? So this idea that all of the statistics can be misinterpreted, I think, has led to some interesting arguments in this space. This is one argument, right? That, well, everything's going to be misinterpreted, so why bother? Why bother changing? Maybe we should just stick with what we've got. At least we know it. And this is kind of where Abelson's law of the diffusion of idiocy, that every foolish application of significance testing will sooner or later be translated into a corresponding foolish application. And there's a little bit, sometimes this is expressed slightly differently with, so everything has misconceptions, why bother changing, just teach it properly. But teaching it properly is obviously really hard, and hardly anyone ever evaluates this. So we see if you've ever been to kind of statistics education conferences or teaching statistics conferences, there's always lots of innovation. People have lots of new ideas about fantastic curriculum that they've developed, but you don't see a lot of evaluation of those programs. Here's another argument. This is an argument that gets used by lots of different people in different ways. So, confidence intervals are more intuitive than p-values, or Bayesian statistics are more intuitive than frequentist statistics. We're natural Bayesians, we should just do that instead. There's lots of ways that this gets used, but it's basically just the same argument as in the first one, just flipped. We don't have any evidence for this, and we rarely look for it or try and evaluate it. And here's another one. P-values and confidence intervals, this is, just for example, are constructed from the same information, so they're the same. I find this one particularly kind of perplexing because we know that different displays of information can communicate better. Some displays communicate better than other displays, and that those good displays can really change how we think about things and how we develop new ideas. Even when things are mathematically equivalent, psychologically they can be different because they're unequivalent when you're trying to guess new things or develop new ideas. The extension of this one is that p-values and confidence intervals are created from the same information, so they're the same. And also people interpret confidence intervals just the same way they interpret p-values. All they do is look to see whether 0 is inside. So what's the difference? You might as well just have a p-value. I've stolen this without permission, sorry. But I think, and also this is not a direct quote, this is what I think you said, so you can correct me if you're wrong. It's what I heard. So in Stephen Goodman's talk yesterday, he was talking about p-values, their dominance, and he said something like, they've robbed us of the language that we need to talk about uncertainty, to talk about confidence, to understand what numbers like this would mean. And I think an extension of this is that it also now makes it very difficult for us to try and to test this argument, to do experiments about this, to see whether displays of information presented as p-values are processed differently to displays of information as confidence intervals, because the dichotomous thinking that's so intrinsic to NHST has permeated everything. So now when we do only interpret confidence intervals as p-values, it's perhaps hard to detect whether there would have been anything else there for us. Okay, so the other question I think we could ask in this space, so this talk is really not supposed to be trying to convince you that confidence intervals are better than p-values. I might have once tried to do that, but that's not what I want to do. What I want to convince you about today is just that this space is these questions about statistical cognition are interesting questions that should have a legitimate space in metascience research. So I think one question we could ask is whether some misconceptions are worse than others. So we know there's a long list of p-value misconceptions, there's a long list of confidence interval misconceptions, but does that mean they're equally bad? So one thing that worse could mean here is that they're just more frequently wrong, that people misinterpret one or the other more often. Or it could mean that they're more seriously wrong somehow, that they're more likely to lead to a conclusion that's very different from what should have been reached, or that there are some kind of extreme consequences in one case and not in the other case. We'll talk about frequency for a minute, and the misconception here that I'm interested in is this common misconception that statistical non-significance is equal to no effect. You see this a lot, right? There was no effect reported instead of just non-significance. So we did some very early, these experiments are small studies, very preliminary research done at least a decade ago. So I will, as I said at the start, I'm not going to be making any claims or any decisions based on these results, but I'm just using them to illustrate that this is an interesting question. So in this little preliminary study that we did with students, we did see some improvement in this misconception when we displayed information with confidence intervals instead of with p-values. So there were 4 scenarios here that we gave to 100 or so students, rotated in a different order. And on average, confidence intervals, when they saw the same information presented as confidence intervals, they made this misconception less often. The other thing we could think about is the seriousness and consequences. And the misconception I want to talk about here is the inverse probability fallacy. So this is a bit of text from Michael Oakes's book, Statistical Inference, that came out in the 1980s. But this same argument's been made lots of times by lots of people. So the idea here is that when you're in a p-value space, if you commit the inverse probability fallacy, it means you're going to have a Bayesian interpretation of a frequentist p-value, that what happens is that you don't just get the probability reversed, but there's a follow-on consequence. And the follow-on consequence is that, well, once you think you know the probability of the hypothesis being true, you forget about everything else. Why would you be interested then in statistical power? So once you've committed that fallacy, you've made the technical error, but there's also this other consequence of neglect of statistical power. At least that's the argument being made here. Very explicitly, I am suggesting that power is neglected by psychologists because given this typical misunderstanding, the inverse probability fallacy, it's now an unnecessary concept. So we know it's been well documented by me and by Richard Marie and Daniel Larkins and various other people that this same inverse probability fallacy is made often with confidence intervals too. It doesn't disappear when you have a confidence interval. This is not an argument about frequency. So when you interpret a frequentist confidence interval as a Bayesian credible interval, sure, that's technically wrong. That's not what it is. But it's hard for me at least to see what the equivalent follow-on from that is. So if the equivalent follow-on for p-values is that you then ignore statistical power, I'm not sure that there is a follow-on consequence here for confidence intervals, which might be something in their favour. Okay, so this is my final point now, which is I don't imagine, this is from a rather obscure journal called the Australian Psychologist in the early 90s. This is an argument that was made to explain the prolonged inertia around the use of null hypothesis testing. So after decades of criticism of this technique and very few defenses or responses to those criticism, it continues to persist. And a lot of other arguments had been made to try and explain that had to do with misconceptions and fallacies, that we so much believe that this tells us something more than it does. But this argument's different. This argument is that the reason that it's hard to break this inertia around statistical practice, to explain why hypothesis testing and p-values have been so persistent. The explanation here is that those things have persisted because we don't treat them as evidence. Instead, in psychology at least, we treat statistics as rhetorical devices. We don't think about them as evidence. We don't think about them as things that change our belief. And it's quite hard to convince people to change practice when they are using statistics as a rhetorical device and not as evidence, because the other arguments have no sway. So I guess what I'm saying then about statistical practice is the opposite of what I was saying about replication. So I think in the case of statistics, we are using them as rhetorical devices, but with replicability, I'm more over here with Mulcahy and Gilbert that this does seem like a problem of conceptual slippage. So in some senses, I guess I'm being more generous about the problems with replicability than I am about problems with statistics. Yes, so finally that it's harder to convince people to change their practice when they're treating things as rhetorical devices and not as evidence. And then finally, I just wanted to draw attention to this. I'm getting really frustrated with only ever giving talks when I'm extremely jet lagged. It's very hard. So what I want you to do is come to Australia and then you can be the one suffering. We're having this conference in November for our new Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science. Thanks.
Can I speak? Your comment about the people using numbers as rhetoric reminded me of something that the great baseball analyst Bill James wrote many years ago about people using baseball statistics not as numbers but to tell stories. So as he put it, people didn't really understand that they could be added and subtracted and multiplied and divided. And he also made the point that the alternative to good statistics is not no statistics, but bad statistics. And he would quote these baseball journalists who would say, oh, I don't believe in the numbers, I believe in the real phenomenon. But then when they would write about it, they would say, this player is great because he batted 300 in this year, whatever. So they would use them. So there just wasn't an alternative. And so I think that supports your point that it's not merely in your field that this is the case.
That's really interesting.
Fiona, thanks very much for that and for taking this problem seriously. I always find it amazing that we can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars on doing studies and then present them in ways that nobody understands or very few people actually understand and most people misinterpret. So getting that interpretation right is really important. I just wondered about the the misinterpretations you get with alternatives to just presenting a confidence interval or a p-value. One possibility that's now commonly being used is to present both. Does that increase or decrease the misinterpretations? Is there any evidence on that?
I don't know. I mean, I think these are pretty much all experiments that haven't been done. But I do remember something about in medicine when so in the late 80s maybe and early 90s when medical journals started changing their requirements for reporting to have to include confidence intervals, that in cases where confidence intervals and p-values were both reported, the way those conclusions were written was much more like p-value only reporting than it was like confidence interval only reporting. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when both are there, the p-value, that dichotomous, significant or not interpretation dominates. You need to take it out to get rid of that, if that's your goal.
Hi, Bobby Spellman, Psychology. Hi, Fiona. Loved your talk. I was really intrigued by your use of the term conceptual slippage, and at first I thought it's right, and then I thought, no. I really think it's a self-serving bias where you think
Right.
you never replicate other people, but they replicate you.
Yeah.
And here's my
Fair enough.
pseudo data for it. I've been in crowds or talking to individuals, okay, mostly psychologists, but I'm pretty sure this will work in a lot of other fields, where I ask them if they've ever replicated somebody else's work, and they'll go, no, I would never do that. And I go, okay, well, did you ever have a student who comes running into your lab and going, I just read this great article and look what they said, but I have all these other ideas from it, and what about this, and what would this mean, what would this mean? And what's the first thing you say? What's the first thing your advisor says? Let's replicate it first,
Right.
and then do something else. And then the people will say, oh, no, but I didn't mean that. That doesn't count. And so people don't see that they're actually doing it and themselves are doing it. And I think that the fact that people were actually doing it in the early days of revolution, crisis, whatever you want to call it, was that, you couldn't get it published and you didn't really want to talk about your lab's failures, but at the water coolers, right, at experiments, it would be like, wait, I had this student working on this, they couldn't replicate. So add to the questions that you ask in the surveys or something like that?
Yeah, I think you're right. And actually, I meant to say that, and I forgot that. When I say that I'm with the concept of replicability, that I'm attributing that to conceptual slippage rather than being a rhetorical strategy. I don't think that rules out the possibility that there's confirmation bias, right? That's still there. We're still humans. But it fits with that. It still fits with the conceptual slippage explanation better than with the rhetorical device one, I think.
Daniele Fanelli, the London School of Economics. I was going to sort of suggest some caution in the interpretation of some of the data that you showed. Not so much the statistical misinterpretations, which is notoriously rather common and sort of generally believable results, and those sort of concepts that no one can really question in a field-specific manner. But the data on replications that you were showing initially, I thought I think are subject to possible interpretations that the kind of questions you ask don't really unveil. So, for example, when you ask essentially if how frequently are replication studies done in your field, and people will say 10%, and that vastly overestimates what? It overestimates the number of papers that are exclusively running replications. That the paper is doing a replication and that's it. But as for example, some colleagues in biomedical research pointed out to me, they will run what they would interpret as micro-replications, for example, in which effectively what happens is that you're building on someone's previous result, and what you do is you set up your controls, effectively ensuring that the original result was done. And so without that being an official replication, sort of you're effectively retesting someone else's result. Or similarly, when you ask how many papers in your field are likely to replicate, there are a lot of different factors behind that question that are really being obscured if one asks a sort of a binary or maybe three option kind of question, because what I think might be happening is that people in any given field might think of papers that, just because of prior evidence or theoretical plausibility, are likely to be valid anyway. They wouldn't even bother questioning them too harshly, whereas other studies, for example, have a too high surprisal value and therefore are less to be believed.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say is that, are you sure that sometimes in setting out these kind of questions, you're not actually constructing a problem purely because, in effect, we are imposing the same kind of simplistic paradigm to all disciplines without considering.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Local
That
factors.
was sorry. That was a long question. I have
Sorry.
to try and remember all the bits. We used an equally vague, underspecified term replication all the way through in every question, so any changes in how they're interpreting replication when we're asking is it important and how many replication studies do you think exist in the literature, we were using the same words. So whatever different interpretation they're attributing there is coming from them, not from us, if that makes sense. So if they're thinking of something different when they estimate that 10%, that's because of the concept slipping around.
Well, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say. That, I wouldn't necessarily interpret everything as a fallacy, because there might be field-specific understandings of concepts that are not quite communicated in the process. That was sort of the general point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that I think there's any fallacies associated with these replication server.
Well, you did say that people overestimate the rate of replications. Well,
right.
As we just said, maybe that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Sure.
The one I
Yeah.
asked 3 question answers. There has been some conceptual slippage about what asking a question.
Ethan Brown, University of Minnesota, Statistics Education.
Yep.
So I just was interested in how. So yesterday we were hearing about statistics as policy and not confusing that with statistics as a practice, or as statistics as something about belief. I was wondering if you could compare or contrast your idea of statistics as rhetoric to this idea from Steve Goodman about statistics as policy, or how do those fit together?
Okay, I think that I agree with you, but I don't know what you think. I think I'm just using some different words, but I feel like I am trying to say the same thing. Do you want to say something?
I can say something when I get.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with you.
All right. Okay.
Hi, I'm Alan Ransel from MIT and Protocol Labs. I study distributed systems. When you ask people, do you need to see something replicated to believe it? And they often say no or maybe. What is their belief based on?
That's a really good question. 16 different things. I can't remember the list. It's things that, but we do have all of this data. So we let survey respondents give their own answer to that, and they wrote just so much stuff. So we've pulled out from that 6. I do remember that there were 16 kind of top things, and they were things to do with experimental design and the types of statistics that were reported. Further down the list are things like institutional trust or author reputation. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about that when I can look up the data.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hi, Gully Burns, Scientific Knowledge Engineering, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So this is a somewhat naive question, and I really love the idea of statistics as rhetoric, because a lot of science is all about argumentation, about trying to construct an argument that fosters a specific, supports a specific claim. Is it a good idea to think of statistics as a kind of common shorthand for a theoretical statement that lies at one end of a spectrum? And going, kind of building on Steve's idea from yesterday, it's like if you're looking at a domain-specific claim that goes into the logic and theory of a specific domain, that would be at the other end of this kind of theoretical spectrum, so a modeling spectrum, if you like. So if you make a claim in statistics that shows an effect at a population, blah, 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 that kind of thing, it kind of gives you a shorthand for saying there is something there. And then if you want to dive into the mechanism, you would then start looking at much more in-depth kind of analyses between different factors and things kind of direct. Is that a good way of thinking about it, or am I being a bit silly here?
I honestly, I really don't know. I mean, it depends whether you mean that would be then the right order for us to do research in.
Well, no, I think of it more as a domain-independent versus a domain-specific thing. So if statistics gives you a common language to be able to talk across disciplines, to be able to summarize information about a specific field and make a clear statement that other people can get based upon the data, then if you kind of want to leverage more domain-specific knowledge, you would then kind of build a model that's a bit more involved, that involves, in-depth knowledge about a specific subject. Is that a good? Am I right in thinking that, or am I off the rails here?
I don't know. Sorry. It sounds very reasonable.
All right, thank you.
Fiona, thank you for that talk, and also thank you for showing a picture of a much younger version of me. I really appreciate that.
From yesterday.
So the quick answer before is I think my point about statistics as social technology serving social purposes and rhetoric are very much the same. And in fact, I was going to show that paper, but I didn't have time. The rhetoric and the social function are sort of two sides of the same coin. But I want to ask a question. I want to ask for help from you and other members of the audience, which is I teach a lot of statistics, particularly to young biomedical researchers. In fact, I have a course starting on Monday. And when I have them for a whole quarter, I can teach all these things. But I know from experience that when I have to give those initial lectures on basic statistical methods, if I introduce some of these ideas too early, they get very upset because they're coming in to learn how to navigate their discipline, how to read their own papers. And if I come in right from the beginning, and I thought I was doing them a service by sort of inoculating them against misconceptions, it's like coming into a seminary, in their first days and saying there's no God. They want to know what a chi-square is. They want to know what a p-value is. They want to know, and they want to be able to navigate their own profession. So if I only have them for a day, I can't teach them what I actually know. If I have them for a week, maybe I can sneak some of this stuff in at the end, but even then they don't know what to do with it. So we're sort of trapped by the sort of social constructions that you've talked about, and I talked briefly yesterday, and other people as well. If we teach them what we actually know too early, it's difficult for them to succeed. We're not talking about PhD students here. We're talking about people we only can, maybe have for a day or a week, even perhaps master's students. So my question is, and again, maybe this can be something you talk about over the coffee break. Has anybody, do you have successful models of how to teach young researchers this material if you don't have them for a long period of time?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. When's the right time? I don't know. Does anyone else want to answer this question? Does anyone know? Do you know? Dorothy knows.
Maybe that's for the coffee break. Simulate data. Simulation labs.
Right.
Not a bad idea. Yeah.
I would second that. My name is Tom Trainer. I'm a practicing R&D scientist in industrial biotechnology. And I want to ask a question about your slides asking are some misconceptions worse than others? So what I feel I've observed in department after department and company after company is that perhaps the biggest misconception about statistics is that the noise is truly random, that they are even appropriate to use many of these fundamental statistical methods on their experimental data. So my question for you is, what about the fields that you're closest to? Does that misconception relevant? And are there surveys that have been done asking practitioners in those fields if they're even thinking about this issue?
I think that, yeah, I imagine that misconception is everywhere, and I don't know about any surveys, but maybe other people do. I think I'm going to crowdsource all my answers from that.
I'm gonna exert the moderator's prerogative for the last question. In psychology, which is the only field I can speak to, the modal situation to me seems to be that it is the most junior faculty who are actually teaching introductory research methods and statistics, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, and that nobody wants to teach it. Do you know if this is the case in other fields, and what contribution do you think this makes to maybe the continuation of poor statistical practices?
I think that's historically true. Is it still true in psychology? I don't know. Maybe it's less true than it used to be. I don't see that so much in ecology. Well, actually, that's partly because they don't teach any statistics until much later. Well, in departments I'm familiar in. But then when the students do get it much later in their degree, it is taught by people who are working in that area and much more invested in the practice. But it's certainly historically been a very serious problem and a very big contributor to where we are now. Okay, thanks.